quien trabaja en el área de ética y está compitiendo por una plaza de investigador en el instituto. Max tiene un par de artículos publicados, uno en Ergo y uno en Ethics, y se especializa en metaética, ¿no? Y hoy nos va a hablar sobre ese tema, en donde va a defender una posición subjetivista, ¿no? Y el texto que va a presentar hoy se llama Subjectivity in the... Moral Objectivity Okay. Bueno, pues muchas gracias. Max sabe español, si quieren. Estoy esperando, me envió Max el handout que ustedes vieron. Y estoy esperando el apoyo secretarial.
¿Pero los van a traer?
Los van a traer, espero. Sí. Bueno, Max va a presentar en inglés, ¿verdad?
Sí, voy a presentar en inglés.
Pero alguna de las preguntas puede ser.
Bueno, el handout son las diapositivas que tengo aquí en español, así si a ustedes no les molesta seguir la charla en inglés,
claro.
no hay problema. Bueno, muchas gracias por la introducción. Estoy muy agradecido por estar aquí y a ustedes por venir. Como me falta la práctica en hablar el español, voy a dar la charla en inglés. Pero si ustedes quieren hacerme unas preguntas en español, luego intentaré contestarles en español también. Si no me pongo demasiado nervioso. So, before I embarrass myself, I'll switch to English. The title of my talk is Moral Objectivity in the Garden of Working Paths. So my topic is moral objectivity, and in particular, why there is very little of it in ethics and how we can do without. So what I'm going to do in my talk is I'm going to attack the idea that morality is objective in a sense that I'm going to explain a bit later. And then subsequently, I'll explore how we can explain crucial aspects of our moral practice without assuming moral objectivity. And finally, I'll suggest that the best way of doing this is to endorse a form of speaker relativism and meta-ethics. So here's the outline of my talk. The argument against moral objectivity that I'm going to present takes the shape of what I believe is the most forceful version of what's become known as the reliability challenge, or the Benacerif field challenge, or simply the Benacerif challenge in the philosophy of mathematics, and more recently in metaethics. So I'm going to begin by outlining this challenge as I understand it, which is worth doing in some detail because it is frequently misunderstood in many ways. I'm then going to move on to present two versions of the challenge. The first one is one that we find in the contemporary meta-ethical literature, especially in authors like Sharon Street and Richard Joyce. And I'm going to argue that this extant argument is problematic, not only because the premise is false, but also because even if we grant the premise, problems remain. Then I'm going to turn to my own argument, which takes the opposing view as a premise. Then I'll address some objections to this argument, and finally I'll address the question of how to live without objectivity in metaethics. So let us say that our moral convictions are reliable if the following principle holds true of them. The principle is super simple. It just says that for most of our core moral convictions, P is true. Now, for the purposes of this talk, we can say that us and our refers to roughly the people in this room who I imagine share many of their core moral convictions, such as that slavery is wrong, or that helping a stranger in need is morally required when it comes at a fairly low personal cost. It's important to note that reliability in my argument is a purely non-modal, a purely extensional principle. It simply states that there is a correlation between our moral beliefs on the one hand and the moral facts on the other, but it doesn't impose any counterfactual conditions on this correlation. Now, as we'll see in a little bit, this is in fact a concessive move to the objectivist, because given a stronger modal notion of reliability, it would be harder and not easier to explain why our moral beliefs are reliable. Now, to avoid a confusion, for the sake of my argument, I'm going to grant the objectivist that this correlation obtains. I'm not going to call into question whether our moral beliefs are in fact true. I will grant this for the argument. So what then is the reliability challenge? Well, reliability is a striking fact that calls out for an explanation, right? It would be incredibly bizarre if there was no explanation of why most of our moral beliefs are true. In Hartree-Field's words, to accept that the reliability of our moral beliefs cannot be explained in principle is, quote, rather as if someone claimed that his or her belief states about the daily happenings in a remote village in Nepal were nearly all true, despite the absence of any mechanism to explain the correlation between those belief states and the happenings in the village. That's to say, if we think that we have true beliefs in a given area, then we should be able to account for the mechanism that yields these beliefs. And any theory of the domain of thought in question should be able, at least in principle, to provide such an explanation. So in ethics, any meta-ethical view should be able to provide such an explanation, at least in principle. Barring, of course, meta-ethical views that reject that we are in fact reliable, such as error theories or a certain form of realism that I call moralistic realism, according to which ordinary moral reasoners are mistaken about most of their beliefs. So, in consequence, any meta-ethical view that in principle debars us from explaining reliability should, at best, be a last resort, because it just incurs a really, really great cost. Now, some, like David Enoch, think that this is a cost that's supposed to be compared to benefits of a view, and that the benefits might still outweigh the cost for certain forms of realism. But in my opinion, it's a cost that we just simply shouldn't accept in meta-ethics. Now, what does it take to explain reliability? That's the next crucial question. And, well, the first thing to note is that explaining reliability is explaining a correlation between facts and beliefs, right? And what does it take to explain a correlation? I think that without going into an extended detour into the philosophy of explanation, we can say that any explanation of a correlation must give us a reason to think that the correlation is not a coincidence. Or that's to say, if it turns out that the correlation is a coincidence, then we can't explain it. I'll later note some exceptions to this principle. And what does it take to provide an explanation that doesn't render the correlation in question a coincidence? Well, it seems that the explanation must establish that the correlation is counterfactually robust. That's to say, and that's just another way of saying that the correlation could not have easily failed to obtain. So counterfactual robustness has two aspects of it. I mean, counterfactual robustness of beliefs, there's a sensitivity aspect on the one hand and a safety aspect on the other. And I mean, one way of thinking about this is that safety means that our beliefs, that Safety means that the facts are sensitive to our beliefs. That's to say, if the beliefs were different, the facts should be correspondingly different. Or if the beliefs were still the same, the facts shouldn't, as it were, veer off the beliefs in nearby possible worlds. Sensitivity, by contrast, is the idea that the beliefs should be sensitive to the facts. And again, there are two special departments of this, namely these two. A principle. So before I go on, I'm going to focus entirely on the sensitivity aspect of the reliability challenge, because I think it is the most forceful way of pressing it. For reasons that I can't address here, I think the safety aspect of the challenge is more or less trivially met. So there are these two dimensions of sensitivity. What I call generalized falsity sensitivity, or GFS. This says that if in nearby possible scenarios, the moral facts had been different, our moral beliefs in those scenarios would be correspondingly different and mostly true. And the other principle, and this latter principle is the one that I think we should focus on, unlike traditional proponents of debunking arguments, says that if in nearby scenarios the moral facts were still the same, our moral beliefs in those scenarios would still be true. That's to say, our moral beliefs could not have easily veered off the moral facts, even holding the moral facts stable. Now, in the reliability challenge, it's very important to understand each of these conditions in the right way. And in particular, not all relevant scenarios are significant. For instance, we don't care so much about a scenario where the world was hit by a meteor and we didn't come to form any moral beliefs at all. That's
It's the first time.
great. Thanks so much. I would have just gone on. So the scenarios that matter are not the ones where we didn't come to form any beliefs at all, or we didn't even have a means of forming moral beliefs or whatever. But the scenarios that we care about are those where we came to form moral beliefs using roughly the same methods that we in fact used and the same cognitive mechanisms. So now I turn to the first version of the challenge, which is what we find in most of the literature. I call this the deterministic argument. And it's the argument that I think we find with some reconstructive effort in the work of people like Sharon Street and Richard Joyce, who have argued that in some sense our moral beliefs do not track the moral facts if non-naturalist realism about morality is true. That's to say, realist views that want to resist the reduction of the moral to the natural. Unfortunately, it's not always entirely clear whether the conclusion of these arguments is supposed to be that we have a reason to doubt that our moral convictions are in fact reliable if moral realism is true, or whether they're more in line with the version of the challenge that I presented, namely that moral realism cannot in principle explain that our moral beliefs are reliable. This is a significant difference because the former version of this argument requires a somewhat contentious view about justification, according to which we need independent reasons to believe that we are reliable in a given area in order to be justified in order for our first order beliefs to be justified. Whereas the latter version doesn't require any contentious view of justification. It's completely independent of the epistemological upshot of failures of sensitivity. That's why I like the latter version of the argument, which is more in line with the reliability challenge as we know it from philosophy of mathematics. Okay. Yeah, sorry, this is what I just said. Theories that, even if we don't take a stance on the epistemological upshot, then theories that can't explain the reliability of our moral views fail to explain a striking fact and incur significant cost. So how do these extant arguments work? Well, they all either explicitly or implicitly call into question what I've called the falsity sensitivity of our moral beliefs. So here is how I understand this argument. And as I said, this takes some reconstruction. So they start from a more or less deterministic premise, namely that our moral evolution provides a plausible explanation of the genealogy of our basic moral convictions, which takes the shape of a fairly deterministic story of why we came to hold our fundamental moral beliefs or basic tendencies to judge, or something like that. The second premise is that if non-naturalist moral realism is true, then the moral facts, since they are causally non-efficacious, could not have played any part in this deterministic story whatsoever. So, from 1 and 2, if the moral facts had been different, then the story would have panned out just the same, and we would have come to hold the same convictions. And this, of course, is a failure of GFS, right? Because there are now nearby scenarios where the facts are different, but our moral beliefs do not follow the facts. And since any explanation of reliability must entail that the correlation between convictions and facts is counterfactually stable, it follows that there is no explanation of reliability if non-naturalist moral realism is true at all. So this is my understanding of the traditional argument. As we'll see later, I reject the deterministic premise of these arguments, and I think there are very good reasons for rejecting it. But even if we accept this premise, a problem remains, and this is the problem I'm now going to spell out. So let us call, oh yes?
No, I just wanted to ask you, what do you mean exactly by the non-naturalist moral realism? What is this view?
It's any realist view according to which moral truths cannot be reduced to essentially physical truths. So they're basically, in contemporary metaethics, realists are basically divided between those who think that moral facts are a kind of sui generis species of fact, and those who think that moral facts are in fact fairly complex, causally efficacious bundles of facts. So, and the traditional argument usually just targets non-naturalist realism. We'll see later, a little bit later, that my argument targets all forms of realism. And I'll say a bit more about the target area then. I'll set it up more carefully. So let us refer as basic moral truths to the moral truths that are not dependent on empirical facts. So truths that will take the form of bridge principles between the descriptive on the one hand and the moral on the other. You know, truths that are more like inflicting pain for pleasure is wrong than I should call my mother on the weekend, which could easily be false because it's dependent on, you know, my mom having a phone and wanting to talk to me and so on. And I think the problem for the traditional argument is that if there weren't any nearby scenarios where those basic moral truths are different, then generalized falsity sensitivity would be trivially true. So traditional debunking arguments rest on the assumption that basic moral truths could be different. And this gives rise to an important difficulty for the challenge based on GFS, which we actually know from the philosophy of mathematics. It's David Lewis who first brought it up. And here's a quote. So Lewis says, "If it is a necessary truth that so-and-so, then believing that so-and-so is an infallible method of being right. If what I believe is a necessary truth, then there is no possibility of being wrong. That is so whatever the subject matter of the necessary truth, and no matter how it came to be believed." And for example, nothing sensible can be said about how our opinions would be different if there were no number 7. This is David Lewis responding to Hartree Field's version of the reliability challenge in the philosophy of mathematics. And it seems that Lewis's response applies mutatis mutandis to the GFS-based challenge in the moral case, provided that we grant that our basic moral beliefs are necessarily true. And in fact, those many moral realists do believe that our basic moral beliefs are necessary. For instance, they believe that there's no possible world where torturing for fun is morally permitted. So it seems like this is a pretty bad problem for the GFS-based version of the challenge. It may, however, not be the last word. Here's Hartree Field in response to David Lewis. If one says nothing sensible can be said about how things would be different if the axiom of choice were false, it seems wrong. If the axiom of choice were false, the cardinals wouldn't be linearly ordered, the Banach-Tarski theorem would fail, and so forth. So Field thinks that we can, after all, make sense of the modality in play. And perhaps similarly, if Field is right, one might argue that it makes sense to say for the deontologists say that if utilitarianism were true, then torture would sometimes be required, or that if fascism were true, then detention without trial would be morally permissible. I'm not entirely convinced, however, that this is a good response to the response in the moral case. For how precisely should we understand the epistemic possibility that an axiom is false or that a fundamental moral truth is false? Is this something that we can even coherently imagine? So compare this with the case of more specific moral beliefs. I believe that I ought to phone my mother on the weekend and tell her how the talk went. But it's not difficult to spell out an epistemic possibility that renders my belief false. Mom might be on the trip. She might not be in the mood for a chat. It's unlikely, I think, but it's possible. But by contrast, it's not as clear that we can really imagine what it would be for fascism to be true, or for slavery to be morally permissible, assuming that we believe these are false. This doesn't strike me as obvious at all. So I think that this should say the falsity sensitivity aspect of the challenge, at least becomes somewhat more mysterious than Field makes it out to be if we take into account the distinction between basic moral truths and more specific ones that rest on empirical fact. I don't think this is the last word on this particular objection, but I do think that there's a more forceful challenge that evades Lewis's response altogether. And I believe, so this more forceful challenge calls into question the truth sensitivity, not the falsity sensitivity of our beliefs. And importantly, unlike the traditional argument that I've just spelled out, it proceeds from the premise that our moral beliefs are highly contingent as opposed to deterministic. So if the premise of if this argument is true, it's not even clear if we should really care that much about the falsity sensitivity aspect, because it denies its premise. So this is the argument to which I now turn. And at this point, I would like to set up the target area of the argument a little more carefully than I did before, because I think that it's quite sweeping. So the target area comprises any metaethical view that endorses reliability itself. That's to say, any metaethical view that's not a form of error theory or what I call moralistic realism, any realist view according to which ordinary moral reasoners are by and large wrong, but perhaps some moral expert can alight on the objectively true moral theory at some point. The second requirement is mind independence. By mind independence, I simply mean the first order counterfactual claim that moral truth is independent of conventions, pro-attitudes, emotions, our moral convictions themselves, and so on. So it rules out that if these were different, then the basic moral truths would be different too. So it rules out constructivist and subjectivist views of morality. And finally, I think we need an anti-pluralism condition, where pluralism is the idea that there could be competing and equally correct theories of morality, so that views that are not intuitively co-tenable, like the view that torturing is always wrong and the view that it's sometimes permitted, could in some sense be jointly correct if held by different moral reasoners. And this rules out the varieties of contextualism and speaker relativism. So we can say that the target area of the argument comprises any objectivist metaethical theory that is not a form of moralistic realism. And this will include the familiar varieties of naturalist realism, of non-naturalist realism, but also recent quasi-realist views endorsed by expressivists like Blackburn and Gibbard. So all these are in the target area. The premise of the argument I defend is this. It's the idea that our basic moral convictions could easily have been very different and in conflict with our present moral convictions. If this premise is true, then our moral beliefs could have easily veered off the moral truth if objectivism is true. In other words, they would be insensitive to truth. Of course, you'll want to know why I think this is a plausible hypothesis, and I'll get to that in a minute, but before, let me just give you the structure of the argument. So here it goes. It starts with the contingency premise. Our basic moral convictions could easily have been different and in conflict with our present fundamental moral convictions. In that case, on any objectivist view, they would have been false. This follows from the fact that they are presently true, reliability, the fact that they don't vary across, that moral truth does not co-vary with certain empirical facts about us, like conventions and pro-attitudes that vary across different turns that our moral history might have taken, and the fact that these different emerging theories cannot be jointly correct. So any objectivist view will entail that in those alternative scenarios, our moral beliefs would have been by and large false. So truth sensitivity fails in any objectivist view. So again, any explanation of reliability must entail that the correlation between belief and fact is counterfactually stable. Counterfactual stability entails GTS. So no objectivist view can explain that we are reliable. This is the argument. So how would I want to argue for contingency? Well, I think, so the bad news is that I can't do it as thoroughly here as I would like to, but I can nonetheless sketch 3 arguments. One way of establishing contingency would be to survey our actual moral history. So for instance, we might imagine it, there might have been many contingencies in the way that our moral concepts and fundamental convictions develop. We might imagine a Nietzschean argument to the effect that morality is essentially a product of the bourgeoisie and depends on the contingent norms of the bourgeoisie. We could imagine a Marxian case, according to which morality simply serves the preservation of the powerful and privileged and is therefore dependent on the views of the powerful and privileged. Of course, such arguments are for the historian to make, not for me from the armchair, given limited time and knowledge. I do think that they bear great promise. The second argument for contingency is an abductive argument, an inference to the best explanation, which proceeds from the fact that we often disagree, especially cross-culturally, on fundamental moral norms. And if we ask ourselves what best explains this actual disagreement, it seems that a very good explanation is that our moral views are contingent on features of our environments and histories. Again, if this is right, the people present in this room could have easily arrived at conflicting beliefs if their environment and history had been different. My preferred argument for contingency is only slightly more conducive to the armchair than the first, and it rests on the etiological function of our moral practice. And this is actually something I've argued in a published paper. So the idea is that the function is roughly to coordinate on mutually beneficial rules of conduct that facilitate social coordination, but there are any number of ways in which social coordination can be accomplished. And the way that reflects our present moral conviction reflects only one such way. And I think a very good way of arguing for this, and this is what I try to do in the other paper, is by actually looking at the way that sociologists, especially those of a game theoretic bent, explain the emergence of social norms. Because once you really look at these explanations, they turn out to be how possible explanations that take us, that will only tell us how a norm can emerge given a contingent starting point. So I'd be happy to talk more about this argument in the Q&A. One question is, of course, how much contingency is there, right? Contingency is a gradual notion. Our moral views could be very contingent or just a little bit contingent. And in fact, there are two gradations here, right? They could be it might be the case that they could be we might ask ourselves how different they could have been, and we might ask ourselves how easily they could have been different to any degree. I do believe that the arguments I just outlined do support a very strong reading of contingency, but maybe not the uber strong reading of contingency according to which we could have arrived at just about any moral view. Because it does seem likely that our history renders a preference for some kind of reciprocity and an aversion to inflicting pain and suffering likely. But even if this is the case, it still turns out that many fundamental norms that we accept will be contingent, such as, for instance, the wrongness of slavery or the norms of distributional justice that we accept. And moral objectivists generally believe that precisely such norms are objectively correct. And this is why I think they are jeopardized by the argument from contingency. So now I turn to some objections, well, especially one objection to the argument that I've just presented. And this objection, again, comes from a different area of philosophy. It's Rosen and Burgess responding to an imagined argument along these lines about mathematics. And their worry is that this kind of argument will overgeneralize to the mathematical and scientific case. So for instance, they point out that if the Nazi campaign against Jewish physics had succeeded, we might not have discovered the theory of special relativity. And that it was lucky that Cantor managed to publish in widely read journals, secure an academic post. And if it weren't for this, then perhaps today we wouldn't have the basic concepts of set theory. So should we doubt that our beliefs about the relativity or set theory that their reliability can be explained as a result? Well, Rosen and Burgess want to say no, and I have to say, I think they're right. I do, however, think that these examples are in an important respect different from the moral case. So I do want to resist the argument, not the examples themselves. And when I first try to think of a response to this, I think I was a little bit too quick. So I'll give you the quick response and then what I now believe is an improved response. I just thought, well, it's obvious. I mean, in the moral case, we're looking at scenarios where we could have arrived at completely different moral theories as a result of contingent turns in our history, using roughly the same methods and cognitive capacities, but in Rosenz's and Burgess's case, this is not so. I mean, if we are imagining scenarios here where we wouldn't have come to form any beliefs in a given area at all. And in other words, we would have taken ourselves off the epistemic market altogether. And we shouldn't care about that. Well, so I think this may have been a little bit too fast. Because it does seem like, at least in some cases, we could have easily arrived at competing scientific theories by the same methods and cognitive capacities. So let me supply 2 examples on Rosenz's and Burgess's behalf. So first, for instance, if Copernicus hadn't come along, then perhaps we would have gone on believing that the sun revolves around the Earth much longer. So that seems like a pretty contingent discovery. And this is a bit of a nerdy example. If a chap named Dürpfeld had dug in the right place and discovered the walls of Troy 6, which is nowadays believed by archaeologists to be the Homeric Troy, and established that these walls that he found are more accurately depicted by Homer's account than those of Troy 2, which was previously discovered by Schliemann and was previously believed to be the Homeric Troy, then perhaps we would still believe that Schliemann was right and the walls of Troy 2 are the Homeric Troy. So again, this is super contingent. It's contingent on where an archaeologist decided to dig. So I've made a problem for myself and I'll try to solve it. That's what philosophers like to do. It's a masochistic enterprise sometimes. I think that there's still an important disanalogy. So there are these cases where correlation is not counterfactually robust and in fact highly unlikely, and we still shouldn't doubt that its reliability can be explained. I concede that. So consider another case. For instance, we had observed that there was an earthquake every time I sneezed today. Then, well, if we had actually observed all these instances, then we shouldn't doubt this remarkable correlation simply on the grounds that it's counterfactually unstable, nor is there really a question about whether it's the reliability of our beliefs can be explained, because each one of them is based on the observation of an instance of the correlation. And similarly, well, I don't think that in these examples I just gave, we should doubt the theories in question simply because our beliefs are, the truth of our beliefs is counterfactually unstable. But the difference, I think, is that in all of these cases, we have independent evidence that the correlation obtains in spite of the fact that it's very unlikely. So for instance, in the sneezing case that I'm imagining, we would have observed all these instances. So we have data that tells us that the correlation obtains against the odds, as it were. And similarly, in the case of the discovery of Troy and Copernicus, we have theories that were subsequently vindicated by the data. And I don't think that we can say anything like this in the moral case. This is the best I've so far done with this objection, so perhaps you'll want to press me on this. So now I'm going to move on to the last section of the talk, and I'm going to consider what, if all this is correct, are roughly the meta-ethical consequences that we should draw from it. What kind of anti-objectivist view might escape the challenge? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to canvass the options with a very broad brush, admittedly, and then I'm going to give some reasons for thinking that one of these options is the best one. So there's a promissory aspect to this last section of the talk, but I think that it is very important to think about where to go from here. So the first thing to note is that unless we want to be error theorists or moralistic realists, then we have to give up either mind independence, anti-pluralism, or anti-pluralism in order to escape the reliability challenge just outlined. In this talk, I'm not going to argue explicitly against error theory or moralistic realism. Suffice it to say that I think it would be desirable to have a non-objectivist meta-ethics that does not attribute to ordinary moral reasoners a pervasive mistake. And that if such a theory can be provided, it would be the most charitable reconstruction of our moral practice and hence preferable to error theory. Of course, the burden of proof here is on the person who wants to provide such a theory. And suffice it to say that moralistic realism pretty obviously faces epistemological problems of its own. And we can raise similar questions about the reliability of the experts that moralistic realist is forced to posit. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'll discuss the remaining options, and I'll argue by elimination of the competitors that a view that I like to call steadfast speaker relativism is the most promising option. Now, as I said, the first option would be to give up mind independence. Mind independence, recall, is the first order counterfactual claim that our fundamental moral beliefs are true counterfactually independently of conventions, pro-attitudes, emotions, and so on. Among those who reject mind independence are, as I understand them, for instance, David Wong and Sharon Street, though Sharon Street's constructivism, I think, is a view about practical reason more generally and not morality narrowly construed. David Wong, for instance, says, in accordance with the constructivist account of morality outlined in this chapter, the moral norms that emerge and get accepted within a group establish the truth conditions for moral statements as made by its members. But the truth conditions are subject to the universal constraints on adequate moralities that spring from human nature and functions of morality. So he, for instance, wants a view where the truth conditions are determined by the actual conventions of a group, but he also wants to impose some objective constraints on admissible views. And my reason for believing that rejecting mind independence is really a disaster in meta-ethics is that it leads to a highly permissive first order view. We have to concede, for instance, that we have to concede that those who hold radically different moral views are doing the right thing. Perhaps we'll be forced to accept that those who hold slaves, given their beliefs, have altogether different reasons from us. And for reasons that I, again, can't go into here in detail, I think that it's of no use here for the agent relativist to impose objectivist restrictions. I think that will just get him straight back into reliability challenge territory. So I don't think we should be agent relativists because of these abominable first order consequences that are really at odds with our intuitions. Another option would be to endorse a form of what we might call conceptual pluralism, which is the view that the meaning of moral terms, in fact, differ across communities with substantially different moral views. This is the view, I don't know if anyone actually holds this view, but Hare adumbrated it in the following passage from the Language of Morals. It's a bit of a chauvinistic passage, but I'll read it out nonetheless. When the missionary said that people who collected no scalps were good, English, and the cannibal said that people who collected a lot of scalps were good, cannibal, they would not be disagreeing because in English, at any rate missionary English, good would mean, among other things, doing no murder, whereas in the cannibal's language, good would mean something quite different, among other things, productive of maximum scalps. There are some interesting questions about how to set up a view like this in meta-ethics that I won't get into in detail. For instance, we'd have to say what makes good in the language of the cannibals, semantic counterpart of good in our idiolect, but let's not get lost here. Hare dismisses conceptual pluralism on the grounds that simply the missionary, simply on the grounds that it seems intuitive that the missionary and the cannibals refer to the same property when they use the word good. Intuitively, their words have the same meaning. I don't think this is a particularly good reason to reject conceptual pluralism, actually, because it doesn't seem obvious that our semantic intuitions across idiolects with highly functionally similar terms should be reliable. I mean, our intuitions about synonymy might just be explained by the fact that they're highly similar. The expressions in each idiolect have highly similar inferential or functional roles. If you compare this to the case of mathematics, there are mathematicians who in fact think they intuit that all set theories, or arithmetics have a common subject matter, and therefore conceptual pluralism can be true of mathematics. But of course, a conceptual pluralist would want to argue that these mathematicians' intuitions are precisely explained by the similar inferential roles, and this is in fact what conceptual pluralists about mathematics tend to argue. I do think that there is a stronger worry about conceptual pluralism, and this is simply that we don't speak the same language on this view as those whose substantial moral views are significantly different from ours, and this renders arguments between them and us highly irrational. So it renders irrational one of the primary and most important uses of moral language, namely to engage in arguments with those who hold different views. And this, I think, is a highly unpalatable consequence of conceptual pluralism, and certainly doesn't yield a rational reconstruction of our practice. And I think it would be preferable to have a rational reconstruction. Now, I think our best shot, and I say best shot because I think that it's still a very problematic option, is to endorse a form of speaker relativism. So speaker relativism, at a first approximation, is the view that moral claims, unless they are referenced explicitly or implicitly to a moral outlook or a moral perspective, are elliptical. That's to say, we can only evaluate substantive moral claims relative to a moral outlook or a moral perspective. And moreover, there's no uniquely correct moral outlook or perspective to which we are all in some sense rationally committed. Now, speaker relativists can still explain the pull that normative statements have on those who endorse a relevant moral outlook. So the idea is that moral outlooks are something that individual speakers can accept for themselves, and that when they encounter a moral statement that is in accordance with their moral outlook, such as if I encounter a moral statement, somebody said to me, it's wrong to torture this man, and I endorsed a moral outlook that rules out torture in all instances, which I do, then what explains why that statement has normative force on me is precisely that I endorse the moral outlook in question. Moreover, I don't think that relativism requires an attitude of indifference. For instance, I may still find other moral outlooks repugnant or outrageous, and I may, at least in some cases, hold on to my own moral outlook in cases of conflict. And this is why I call the view steadfast. But I must at the same time acknowledge that others who endorse these repugnant moral outlooks are not making a rational mistake. They're not rationally in error. They are, as it were, placed in an unfortunate situation from my perspective. And so this is what I'll concede, and I think it's a fairly big concession. Relativists still have to explain the mechanics of moral debate in cases of fundamental conflict. And in particular, they have to give an account of moral conflict that doesn't make moral conflict simply seem like bashing our heads or mere goading. And this, I think, is rather difficult. And in fact, it's the problem that I've been concerned with recently and hope to be concerned with in the future, namely to give an account of moral language that can A, do without objectivity and yet provide a reconstruction, a rational reconstruction of these cases of conflict along relativist lines. This concludes my talk. Let me just briefly summarize what I've done. I've covered a lot of ground. So the first claim that I defended is that traditional debunking arguments are no good. That involved clarifying them. They are an instance, I think, of the reliability challenge that I outlined, properly understood. But I hope that I've shown that their deterministic premise is questionable, and that even if the deterministic premise is granted, it is very difficult to make sense of the modality in play in the argument. I've then gone on to show that there is a more forceful challenge that proceeds from a denial of the premise of the original challenge. It's based on the idea that our moral convictions are highly contingent. And moreover, it appeals to a sensitivity principle that doesn't face analogous questions about the modality in play. I've suggested that in response to this more forceful challenge, we should give up the notion that morality is objective. And I've been daring enough to suggest that the best way of doing this is to endorse a form of speaker relativism. Thank you for bearing with me.
Leave your hands up. Well, yes.
Hi, so thanks for your talk. I'm more interested in a positive view because I'm finding it, you call it relativism, but I'm finding it hard, the little that you did say about it, to distinguish it from a form of contextualism. So when people speak of context-dependent expressions, so to speak of certain expressions being like knowledge, like knows that, being context-sensitive, they relate it to what the speaker, in that case the attributor of knowledge, is thinking. So it's linked to speaker. When they talk about relativism, they tend to go for not something that depends on the actual speaker, but maybe on someone who's doing some evaluation of a particular statement, right? That can happen later on. Now you link it to speakers, so that kind of threw me off a bit, and you said that it had to be that basically they were any sort of substantive moral assertions were elliptical, or some that relativize to a moral outlook of some sort, right? So I just want to I wanted to get clear on why you call this relativism rather than a form of contextualism, and because you say it's elliptical forward, so it can really match up contextualism.
Oh, what I wanted to say is that it's not that it's short for, but rather that unless the claim is referenced to an outlook, it's missing something. It can't be evaluated for truth at all. That's what I meant by elliptical. But the short answer to your question is that the view is fully compatible with contextualism, but I don't mean to commit to that kind of semantic theory. And I do have some views in the philosophy of language in the background that should I go into these a little bit?
I would like it because it's your positive view. So
right, but it's a positive. So this philosophy of language aspect, it's a part of the view that I'm still working out, and ultimately, So there's some, I'll have to say something bold that I can't fully corroborate in order to, so I don't think that there is a substantive difference between the varieties of assessor relativism, contextualism, and expressivism. And I believe that what all of these views have in common can be better captured in within a conceptual role framework.
Okay.
And this is the kind of theory that I'm hoping to develop.
So would linguistic evidence be relevant? I mean,
to
the position, because some people argue in favor of formative relativism because
retraction data in these,
yeah,
data, I mean,
gradation, things like that agrees whether they're gradable or not. Sort of, I'm just trying to get.
Oh well, maybe. Sorry. I didn't mean to. Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I mean, I didn't mean to deny that the difference across the board. But I think that with normative language, there may just be one view to which all of these views point, and I mean, of course, in order to see whether there's a substantive difference, you'd have to look at all these specific arguments that people are giving in the debate, like retraction data, for instance. And my impression is, but this is actually leading us away from my own view. My impression is that contextualism and other forms of relativism can explain all this data equally well, because contextualists can always appeal to pragmatics.
Okay, I'm gonna leave it at that.
And but yeah, so but that's. But the I mean, the one-line responses, I think that these views all capture an important insight about moral language that's better described in a framework that's altogether different, the conceptual role framework. Of course, this is not something that I could hope to convincingly argue for in just a few minutes. Yeah.
Thank you. I also have some concerns with the positive part of your talk and your position. In particular, two things. How can your position avoid the first problem, the first order bad consequences of other forms of relativism that you actually use to discharge those forms of relativism? For example, say
rejections, agent relativism, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing that you didn't mention much. How can your view actually avoid these really bad first order consequences that other relativist views have? And the other one is, how can your view make sense of moral disagreement, in the sense of not just saying we're talking past each other, we're in different speaker communities.
Yeah.
And so when I say that genital mutilation is wrong, I'm just talking past each other. I don't know, or I'm just saying something different.
Why does the view not give rise to the same problem as conceptual pluralism?
Exactly. Exactly. How can your view avoid those problems that you use to discharge other relative views?
Yeah. Yeah, excellent questions. So the first question, why doesn't it give rise to abominable first order consequences? I think there's a fairly flat-footed answer to this, which is I can continue to judge others relative to the outlook that I endorse on this view. And this may well be an outlook that rules out genital mutilation. So I can still judge that those who engage in this practice are repugnant from my perspective. I will also have any number of reasons to suspect that they are making a mistake of sorts. That can be that they are being incoherent in some way, that there are values that they endorse that conflict with this practice that they engage in. But if you imagine a perfectly coherent version of these people, then all I can say to them as a relativist is that they are very unfortunate. And unfortunately, that's all I can say. So this is, and you might think that that in itself is an unacceptable consequence of the view. It's a bullet that I'm willing to bite. Your second question, I think, that's a really good point to press me on. And in this talk, I really haven't told you enough about how I want to deal with disagreement to convince you that I can. And I know that it's always a bit obnoxious to refer to another paper. I do have a paper where I try to give an explanation. And what I tried to say there is that we can reconstruct moral assertions in these cases of fundamental conflicts as it were dueling invitations to enter the moral outlook of the other person. And that in many cases we can give an account of the incentives that the interlocutors have for issuing and accepting such invitations. So that there is, at least in a core of cases, there is something in between the mere goading to which relativists seem to be committed to and the highly rationalist view of moral debate that objectivists endorse.
Ángeles.
Voy a preguntar en español.
¿Está bien?
Puedes responder en inglés.
Mm.
En realidad, yo tengo un par de preguntas sobre el argumento de la historia a favor de la contingencia.
Vale.
Creo que en efecto es una manera de argumentar que nuestras convicciones morales son las que son por el momento histórico, etc. Pero me parece que eso no se contrapone o no se contradice con la idea de que hay cierta objetividad moral. Me parece que eso es algo que tú estás suponiendo. Y pienso, por ejemplo, en Marx, que es alguien que precisamente diría que trazarle la genealogía de las ideas es lo que nos permite desvelarlas de ese velo que las hace parecer lo que no son, y que hay hechos que están detrás de ese desvelamiento, y que es lo que sostiene la verdad de nuestras creencias, ¿no? Y es lo que va a acabar con la ideología, etc. Entonces, si pensamos que hay estos hechos, ¿no? Y que justamente una investigación histórica, una comprensión del desarrollo histórico de nuestras ideas morales, les daría precisamente la objetividad que tú crees que la contingencia les quita, ¿no? Entonces podría uno tener una posición contingente pero objetivista, me parece. No sé si tienes algo que decir, porque entonces el argumento no sería tan fuerte como pareces, me parece, no estoy segura de eso.
Y si esa es tu posición, ¿cómo explicarías el hecho que seamos confiables sin estabilidad contrafáctica? Yo creo que eso es el problema, que la contingencia, bueno, si nuestras convicciones son muy contingentes, no podemos explicar por qué seamos confiables de forma contrafácticamente estable. Bueno, eso sería mi respuesta. No sé si te va a convencer.
Pero, sí, de acuerdo.
Thank you very much. I would like to press you a little bit on your argument. So, in particular about the contingency and how much support you can get from in favor of contingency. And I'm going to focus on your third argument because this is the one that you really think is working. So something that might happen is that our psychological conviction, sorry, I'm trying to read these things.
Do you want me to go back to the...
That's fine. Thank you. So you said that our psychological conviction, the core one, could be very different and in conflict. Let's keep the conflict aside, so just say that they are very, very different, and I'm going to focus on the conflict. And to say, according to the objectivism, they would be incorrect. And I'm saying, you know, they might be very different, but not incorrect. So I might say, so imagine the following belief. The length, so Angeles is 1 meter, between 1.60 m and 1.80 m. And my says that it's between 165 and 175. So those are different, but nonetheless, both are correct, right? So the point has to be that they have to be in conflict, right?
Yes.
So the question is whether your argument in three, you didn't give us any reason to think that they might be in conflict. So it might be that there are different ways in which moral beliefs can contribute to the social coordination, but nonetheless they are not in conflict. So, could you say, and a small question, just because I'm interested, is, and it's related to your other paper, so you can just say, we can talk about that later, is that if the function, the etiological function of moral evolution is social coordination, how we come to have moral beliefs about people who don't belong to our society or animals? I don't know whether like, I don't know, killing dogs when I'm walking down the street is, I think it to be bad, but I don't think that it plays any role.
Yeah, I know where you're going with this. Yeah. I'll say something about your second question first, because I think I have something more punchier to say about it. It's this function thesis that I want to endorse might be a little more limited. I want to say that there's a so I want to say it's the etiological function. So it's basically, it explains why we have the practice and the concepts in the first place. And this doesn't rule out that it has subsequently served other functions, such as even, you know, very hypothetical, moral views about people with whom we would never be in a position to coordinate, or norms for treating creatures that were not even people, but those would be subsequent function that our practice may have in addition to this original raison d'etre. Is that? Yeah. And your first question, let me see if I understand it correctly. So the way I understood it, and this could be wrong, is that you're imagining a view that's somewhat vague. That's to say, it's okay to treat people like this, but it might also be okay to treat them differently. And then you're imagining that that view would not come into conflict with similarly open views that we might have developed.
So you need to argue
is that
difference for conflict. And
yeah.
I see that you can give.
Did I get you right there though? Yeah.
So I'm rephrasing just to,
yeah.
to be sure. So is that having difference is not enough? I mean, I grant you that your argument gives me difference, but what I'm saying is that you need conflict, and it's not so clear to me that you get conflict by your argument in three.
Oh, I see. I understand. I don't know if I can answer this in brief, but the basic thought of this argument is that if moral norms serve the solution of coordination problems, and if they represent specific ways of solving coordination problems, then the norms that we presently have represent one such way, and they can't be compatible with alternative ways of solving the same problems. I mean, simply because they mandate different courses of action
so
in the same.
If I give you a specificity by a specificity plus difference, you get conflict. So what I'm not giving you, that's why I use the example, I was trying not to give you this specificity. So with the Angeles.
Are you denying that our views are in fact specific enough? Because, so here's something else that I was going to say at first. So if you're imagining a view that isn't specific, that's sort of highly permissive across a range of scenarios, and you're saying, I want to be an objectivist about this permissive view, then my response would be, yes, you do escape the reliability challenge. But if I'm right, your view will be uncomfortably permissive.
Then in your favor, just put it this way.
This is my argument in the other paper. Yeah, it's a dilemma. You can make the view permissive. It's like a graded dilemma, right? You can go to the, you can be very specific, then you won't have any repugnant first order consequences, and you're squarely in the target of the challenge, or you can move towards a less specific view, and you'll gain the bad consequences, and you'll be, yeah.
Do you have a follow-up? No? Okay. So then, Miguel Angel?
I want to ask you about something that I think is a presupposition of that runs through the whole discussion. And it has to do with the sensitivity constraint of moral belief. In the argument that you examined first, there is a sensitivity to falsity in play, right? And then in the argument that you develop, there is a sensitivity to truth in place. So a sensitivity requirement on moral belief is assumed. And my question is that the fact that this type of constraint is assumed suggests that you are assuming that the normativity of belief is to be assimilated to the normativity of knowledge, propositional knowledge, because the sensitivity requirements of knowledge are a paradigmatic necessary condition for knowledge, at least for externals. So what would you say to someone that questions that assumption and believes that it is a mistake to try to assimilate the normativity of moral belief to the normativity of propositional knowledge, and that most of the problems that arise and that you discuss come from exactly making that assumption? What would you say to this person? Imagine that this opponent of you believes that the normativity of belief, of moral belief, should be assimilated not to the normativity of propositional knowledge, but rather to the normativity of a different status. For example, entitlements, where an entitlement is.
You're thinking about a position like Crispin Wright's, for instance.
For example,
yeah.
That's one way of interpreting that alternative form of normativity. So this opponent of you can describe you the merits of opting for this alternative way of understanding the normativity of belief by partly describing how it allows you to avoid many of the problems that you run into by making this sensitivity assumption, this sensitivity constraints, assuming them. So what would be your reaction to this opponent?
Yeah. Yeah, I think this can be said in. I think there's a pretty determinate reaction here. It's that. So you're absolutely right that this kind of constraint figures prominently in the theory of knowledge. In fact, these are generalized conditions of Nozick's tracking account.
Yeah.
But my argument is designed precisely in order to avoid this kind of objection, because I don't wish to take a stance on how either of these requirements actually relates to moral knowledge. That's to say, I'm not taking any stance on the epistemological upshot. The argument simply goes via the explicability of reliability. So I can remain entirely non-committal about whether, what kind of reasons we need to accept a moral claim. And to be honest, I think there may be something right about the idea that there is an entitlement, that we have to leave the domain of epistemic rationality narrowly construed and move into the domain of entitlement. So I think I'm actually sympathetic to that idea. And I think that this version of the challenge is not actually committed to the view about the epistemological upshot of principles like this.
Elias.
Well, it's probably a minor point, but your objections against the deterministic argument basically assume that the deterministic element somehow rules out any contingency in the situation. And I don't see why those two things are incompatible. In fact, I think that they are compatible. Right? I mean, determinism just says that being the world what it is, there's only one possible outcome. But contingency means if the world would have been different, then the outcome would have been different. So I don't see the incompatibility between determinism and contingency. That's clear.
are you suggesting that we could have a deterministic explanation that's compatible with at least some form of epistemic contingency, like an ability to conceive of alternative histories, for instance?
I think what I'm saying is that basically your argument and what you call the deterministic one are more or less the same. I mean, you could just argue the same from the deterministic standpoint, because you would say that by me saying that there's a deterministic outcome, I'm not saying that there's no contingency involved, right? So, especially if what you have in mind for the deterministic case is something like Darwinian evolution, something like that. So it is deterministic in the sense that being the world where it is, the outcome is what it is. But it's also contingent in the sense that if the world would have been different, then the outcome would have been different, which is the contingency you're using.
Well, I think there is a sense in which the two premises are incompatible, because contingency, as I understand it, tells us that the actual outcome is dependent on features that could have very easily been different. And I just don't see how that's compatible with the idea that from the get-go, there was only one endpoint, right? If I'm here somewhere in history, and there's this garden of forking paths that our moral evolution could have taken, and now we round up here, but there were all these junctures where we could have easily gone another way. It strikes me that that just rules out a deterministic explanation. I mean, but of course, there might still be. I mean, there could still be a higher level deterministic explanation. Maybe, some omniscient Laplacian being could still have made all the right predictions. But I think if evolution itself makes for contingent junctures, then that rules out that evolution will give us a deterministic explanation.
Yeah, let me just say this.
Maybe
I have a background in physics, so for me, determinism means something very specific. And probably just like misunderstanding.
Oh, this helps. What you just said helps.
Probably what you are trying to convey, I would call it not determinism, but something like stability, right? So then, like, small perturbations would not lead to a very different outcome. So it's not only determinism; it's just that, I mean, given that the world is what it is, then the outcome is determined.
This is really helpful for me.
That doesn't say at all that if you would go and change a little bit the initial conditions, then you will have a very different outcome.
Yeah, this is a really nice way of putting it. And maybe if I had more of a background in the sciences or the philosophy of explanation, I would have said something similar. I think what I'm really concerned, the feature I'm really concerned with is that kind of instability, where a slight perturbation would have led to a very different outcome. And in fact, if you look at the game theoretic models that explain the evolution of norms, this is precisely what they're like. Small changes of initial conditions or perturbations in the population would lead to different outcomes. And yes, in a sense, this is compatible with a form of determinism. Yeah.
Yeah, let me just say this too.
But I don't think it's the kind of determinism to which debunking people appeal.
Yeah, probably you're right. All right, go.
But we can talk about it.
We have time because we have a lot of questions. Sorry about that, Elias. Edu?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk. I really liked it. I think you managed to sort of convince me.
Oh, wow. I didn't have to convince anyone.
Thanks a lot. So I made more than comments that I think might be helpful. So there's this section of Morality of Worlds where Lewis is trying to address an objection that his view entails moral indifference. Because whatever could have happened in moral terms, like what could have been better, is not something that happens here. It's something that happens to someone else in a different world. Forget about that objection. The interesting thing is Lewis's reply, and he says, briefly put, moral beliefs are egocentric beliefs. What I care about is not possibilities or mere possibilities. What I care about is that it is me in this world that is in that situation. So I care about I care about the world that I live in.
Not my counterparts.
Yeah. So that is very close to sort of some kind of agent relativism in terms of what matters in moral discourse. There's Andy Egan tried to develop something like that for semantics with his idea of centered worlds.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that
a
proposal.
nice paper that I don't know if he published that's called Why Ethics is All About Me. It'd be interesting to, I don't know how that could connect with your account, but I think there's probably the idea of using centered worlds as the contents might be helpful for your view. And you could use them in a way that need not be contextual. So you have a fixed content.
Yeah.
It's just that part of the content requires the individual.
Yeah.
Part of it is one more of the indices.
Do you mind if I jump in for a second?
Sure.
Because it's interesting. My impression is that, well, Crispin, right in my dissertation defense, pressed me on a view that I failed to understand throughout the defense, which sounded rather like this. And I think the basic idea was that realists could make a certain rigidifying move so that our views are counterfactually stable in the sense that if we understand them as views that apply only to us, but not our counterparts, and then this could actually be an objection to the argument, I think, because you do, or at least that's how he thought of this, because you would.
I'm not sure that on the Lewisian view you would have problems with rigidity, because there's no rigidity.
But you are in fact, but you are in effect relativizing the content of the views to the inhabitants of these scenarios, right?
Even
I thought that was the suggestion. So,
yeah.
so I believe that torture is wrong, but I don't care about my counterparts being tortured. I care about the people here in this world, and so I thought the suggestion was that my views should be construed as views about the people that inhabit a given possible world. Is this what you had in mind?
Yes, that's part of the idea. But the main difference there is that for Lewis, this means it's some kind of a de se attitude, which changes the content. So it's a matter of distribution of properties, more than accepting or attributing propositions. So that you could use the whole sort of the technical tools and move them, I think, on your behalf. I'm not sure you.
Oh, as a sort of relativist proposal. Yeah. Yeah, this is really interesting.
That could help, I don't know. Another comment is.
Tell me where to find the passage from Lewis when you get a chance.
Yeah, sure. And then another quick comment. I think there's more. I don't know if it depends on how you're distinguishing the advantages of your view, but one that you did not mention in the talk is that it seems that you have no problems with the open question argument. So an advantage of your view is that you need not assign a fixed content that everyone should accept for normative terms. And so no wonder why there's always an open question about whether or not you're defining a term. You just go and find someone else that has a different view, and the question will be open once you're trying to define the moral term. So this is something that, I mean, it's not a surprise that your view accounts for that.
This is true. I think of this in terms of something like acceptability conditions or language entry rules, and I think they are somewhat indeterminate, and that makes for a certain kind of open question. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I'm not always good at advertising my views.
The last comment.
Edu, can we postpone that comment after? You have asked 2 questions and we have 4 people more, so don't be.
Didn't ask any question.
Okay. Okay, good.
También voy a hacer una participación en esto. Perdón. A ver, tu postura, como casi todos los argumentos evolutivos, depende de separar de alguna forma nuestras capacidades cognitivas de los hechos morales.
Ajá.
En este caso, dependiendo de relaciones evolutivas contingentes. Entonces mi pregunta sería, ¿qué tan separados deberían de estar? Porque, por ejemplo, si nos quitas la capacidad individual de hechos morales de saber cómo son,
Ni yo tampoco.
perdón, sí.
Sí. Estás hablando con un extranjero.
Deben que estar los hechos morales de nuestras capacidades cognitivas, porque si, por ejemplo, están tan separados que no podemos ni siquiera individuar los hechos morales, saber cómo son, entonces no podrías de entrada separarlos para tu argumento.
I know where you're going with. It's a good objection. It's of course I'm committed to. I face all the problems that people who want to, people in the corresponding epistemological debate face about, how to individuate our methods, and is that still a way of forming moral beliefs, or is it something different altogether? And sorry, I interrupted you, but I was just jumping. So, but I think this turns into a difficult objection if you imagine a realist who says, well, those people in alternative scenarios, they're not even forming moral beliefs. We don't know what they're doing. I don't know if this is what you had in mind. Yeah. And I don't have a systematic theory of how to individuate methods. But I think that in the moral case, they're intuitively individuated in terms of the emotional capacities that give rise to our moral views. So in that sense, I want to be a sentimentalist about morality.
Esto se podría volver un problema más grande porque para empezar, para tu argumento, tendrías que haberlos individuado para decir que están separados de nuestras capacidades.
Que son separados de...
Los hechos morales y nuestras capacidades para reconocerlos. Para tu argumento tendrías que decir que están separados, o sea, no podemos acceder a ellos.
But I think this actually helps me, I think, because I think intuitively we should not build the beliefs that the methods yield into the methods. And I think that a realist who is building, say, our philanthropic views into the very method is making that mistake. And that strikes me as a suboptimal way of thinking about methods in this case. So I think actually that there should be a separation between the methods and the beliefs that they yield, I think is actually helpful for me.
Well, thanks for your talk. I was wondering whether your agent relativism is able to overcome the reliability challenge. And there is a sense, I think, in which the answer would be positive. But the sense in which I think that you could answer positively to these questions would commit you to saying that what true means in the definition of reliability that you gave us at the very beginning is ambiguous, right? So what I'm trying to say is the next thing. If you say that the agent relativism is able to overcome the reliability challenge, then you mean by true, you mean very, I don't know how to say, minimalistically, contextually, meaning of truth.
I think a deflationary notion suffices.
A deflationary notion of truth.
We can spell out the challenge without using the word true, in fact.
Yeah, but that would be a bit weird, right? Because what you'd be saying would be that the agent relativism is able to overcome the reliability challenge, whereas the objectivism views cannot, but we would be meaning different things by true when we speak about reliability. And I don't know, it sounds a bit weird. I don't know if I did myself clear.
Yeah, I think so. I'd be tempted to say that the agent relativist view overcomes the challenge because the only judgments that are true or acceptable according to it are themselves perspectival. And perspectival judgments are robustly correct. That's what I would like to say. But I think I may not have fully understood why you think that there's an equivocation on the sense of true here. I think that's something I didn't quite get.
Because for agent relativism, whether a moral judgment or a moral belief is true, is a relative truth, I guess, or a robust truth. Because if it's a robust truth, I don't know in what sense is relativist your position.
Well, so I mean, I think maybe Harman's analogy helps here. If you think about, our judgments about simultaneity, for instance, are relative to a frame of reference. There are no absolutely true judgments about simultaneity, given special relativity. But nonetheless, these judgments that are relative to a frame of reference are robustly true. And similarly, I want to say, moral judgments are only true relative to a moral outlook or a moral frame of reference. But relative to those frames, they are robust.
But then robust means the same both for objectivists and for relativists?
Yes, someone else in an alternative scenario or from a culture with different norms can judge that we are making the right calls relative to the norms that we accept. We're not, as it were, mistaken about the moral outlooks that we in fact endorse.
Hola, casi me convences del argumento.
Casi.
Porque creo que tiene los mismos errores que tiene el argumento de Bellman sobre el relativismo social moderado. ¿No? Aparte moderada, cuando dices que no tiene que ser objetivista, pero tampoco tiene que ser permisivo, creo que puede enfrentar los mismos problemas de Bellman. Porque para eso...
¿En cuáles problemas estás pensando?
Moral relativism, moderate moral relativism, paper.
Sí.
Dice el texto, Bellman tiene que presuponer otro tipo de objetividad fuerte, que es la de la razón práctica. ¿Sí? Si el relativismo del hablante tiene que presuponer que podemos ponernos de acuerdo lingüísticamente los unos de los otros para que no sea tan radical el relativismo. Pero si alguien puede pensar que también se puede destruir la razón práctica, entonces creo que el relativismo es muchísimo más.
Bueno, eso de hecho es lo que yo pienso. Yo creo que la razón práctica también es una cosa bastante relativa como la moral, así que no estoy de acuerdo con Bellman. ¿Y cuáles son los problemas que eso causa?
Es muy permisivo, ¿no? Porque cada comunidad construiría sus propios patrones con su propia noción de razón práctica y no habría posibilidad de diálogo. O sea, la razón práctica en Bellman permite el intercambio,
sí,
pero si lo destruimos ya no habría, sería un relativismo más bien radical.
Sí. Pues lo que quería decir yo es que de una forma sí el resultado es permitivo, así que no podemos decir que ellos son irracionales o algo así, pero podemos seguir diciendo que son repugnantes de nuestra propia perspectiva. Pero hay una pregunta sobre, bueno, ¿por qué es que, cuál es la función de decir eso y cómo funcionan los argumentos con ellos? Y eso sí es un problema grave para mi posición.
So you have 1 minute for your question.
Okay, it's just a short, the question. So I really like the topic.
Thank you.
And, it is about. I think you can soften some of the intuitive impact of the relativist view that you're like. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the suggestion is using something you already said, like the function of a moral evaluation is social coordination. So perhaps two different outlooks, but I mean, it's very restricted suggestion because it will not apply to very, very different outlooks. But if you have two different outlooks, which are not like totally different, but somewhat different, and perhaps you can, make them, compatible, or like design a further new moral outlook in terms of those. If there are like more general interests that are shared by both the both communities, so perhaps the point is that like the problems with relativism could be like softened a little if you take into account more general interest.
I agree, and I take that friendly suggestion, and in fact, I do try to appeal to a shared value of moral trust in a separate paper. So I think that entering relationships of moral trust is something that we can accomplish using moral language, and that this interest is shared across a wide range of communities and allows us a degree of coordination even with those whose moral outlooks are somewhat different. So yes, I'm completely on board.
Still we wouldn't have lo siento porque no hubiera alcanzado todas las preguntas, tendría que haber sacado a alguien más en un momento. Son los dos. Just join me in thanking the speaker for this wonderful.
Thanks for sharing.
Sí, pero de todas maneras, o sea, tengo gente que se quedó fuera igual, o sea, no, sí. I'm so sorry.
Vamos a tener una entrevista con...
I feel honored that this is such interesting.
By the way, I'm Paloma, nice to meet you.